couple, 3 years ago, my son, who lives in Boston and occasionally gets to read the New York Times, had sent me this email all excited. And he told me in the email that the Times had done a series of recipes of favorite ones from each and every one of the 50 states. And he was excited because he said Indiana had featured persimmon pudding. And I thought, wow, that's a little odd. And the reason I thought it was a little odd is because persimmon pudding is not a big favorite in the northern part of the state. And the reason for that's simple. The trees don't grow so well up there. The persimmon tree, according to my daughter, Jessie, who looked up the Latin genus word for it and everything, said that the trees originated in Virginia and came west and then north, but they don't go very far north of Indianapolis. So the folks in the northern half of the state really don't know that much about persimmon pudding. And I thought, that's odd. They choose that as the state recipe. The second thing that was odd about it was that as I read down through this recipe, they called for the Fuyu persimmon. Now, the Fuyu persimmon can be found on your grocery shelf if you live in a big city like we do. If you live in a small town like Mitchell, probably not. Oh, sorry, I don't get along with microphones for some reason. Anyway, the Fuyu persimmon is oriental, and it's large, and it's shipped in from California, and it does not ripen well here. Jessie decided to experiment, and she felt she wasted the ingredients. The recipe ran over the bowl, the pan, and didn't have any flavor. So I thought, this is a problem. These people have made a horrible mistake at the New York Times. I'm going to write to them and tell them off. So I did. And I felt like, as the matriarch of my family, I was duty and honor bound to give them the history and experience of my family with persimmon pudding. This goes all the way back to the 50s, when I was a little girl. And my mother, Edith Catherine Fry Terrell, was a person who got fairly nervous right after Labor Day. Now, I thought, got nervous a lot because she always made her pot of coffee in the morning in her beautiful stainless steel hourglass-shaped Sunbeam coffee maker. And those 8 cups would disappear by the end of the day. And she did occasionally get some nerve pills from the doctors. But I thought it had to do with coffee. But after Labor Day, she'd get especially nervous. And the reason for this is because it was getting to be persimmon time. Now, there's a little trick about persimmons you really ought to know, just in the case you've got a persimmon tree in your backyard. The trick is, the persimmons ripen and get really sweet, and then a frost comes, and they want to fall. You do not ever want to pick a persimmon off a tree. If you do, you're going to get the pucker of your life. So, persimmons need to fall from the tree. Well, Mother would get nervous there wouldn't be a frost. Southern Indiana, after all, in Mitchell, how many frosts do they get in September every year? So she'd get pretty nervous and worked up. And the other reason is that she was very competitive in nature. And the Persimmon Festival would be coming up. The Persimmon Festival was suggested by George Bishop, the school superintendent, to the Rotary Club one day in the 40s. And they liked the idea, and all of a sudden, every September in Mitchell, Indiana, to this day, there is a festival. And on Main Street, you'll find the usual carnival rides and the games and the food tents with persimmon puddings, and a queen contest and a parade. But the highlight of the whole thing is the contest. Leading up to this contest, once in a while, we'd be riding down the road on a Sunday afternoon, and Mother would turn to Dad and yell, "Willard, stop the car!" And what that meant was she had seen a persimmon tree on the side of the road, and she knew that it was time for those persimmons to be on the ground, and she would hop out of the car, grab her bread wrapper, her sack, her apron. She probably would have pulled up the front of her skirt to make something to carry the persimmons in, and she would rush over and get the persimmons. Now, you got to remember, these persimmons are little orb shapes, persimmon colored, of course, orangey, with a little reddish brown on the side. They are very juicy and very squishy. And they have the cute little, four-cornered hat on top. When they fall to the ground, they kind of smash. You just can hardly help but pick up a persimmon off the ground without getting a piece of leaf or a little dirt. Well, who cares about the dirt? And, that sort of thing. Never any bugs or worms, though. I don't know why. But anyway, you have to not mind that this is not exactly a spick and span floor of the woods. So you take the persimmons home, and in those days they had these cone-shaped colanders made out of metal that had holes in them and a sort of vertical rolling pin, and you put the persimmons in it, and despite all the huge almond-shaped seeds inside these persimmons, you would squish this around and the persimmon pulp would fall into a bowl below. And if you were lucky, you'd get a cup or two of pulp, and then that would become the persimmon recipe. The persimmon pudding recipe is very simple, by the way. It's, mainly the usual ingredients: flour, sugar, butter, some milk, a little salt, the cinnamon and little nutmeg, that kind of thing, eggs. You bake it in a 9 by 12 pan for about an hour, and you've got this really sickeningly sweet pudding, which has its tang of its own. You can only serve these things in 2 or 3 inch squares with a little whipped cream on top. That's all you can take. But it has a distinctive flavor. It is wonderful, and many women try to duplicate the recipe that was in my family. And every year, the highlight of the festival in Mitchell, Indiana, is the persimmon pudding contest. And at least 100 entries would come in every year to the public service building on Saturday morning, and a half a dozen really brave Mitchellites would go in there and taste every one of those puddings, and 20 people would be declared winners. In 1953, my mama was the first place winner. And they had a beautiful stage decorated with, the usual pumpkins and stalks and corn stalks and such. And Mother's Prize was presented to her by the governor of Indiana, Henry Schricker. And she was the only one of the 20 that year that got a kiss on the cheek. That was the highlight of my mama's life. But the fun part was she would start these puddings on like Friday morning. She'd start baking her puddings. And by Saturday morning, she'd have about 8 of these puddings sitting in the kitchen and the dining room. And then she'd select the one that she thought was just perfect, that was just the right reddish brown and not too many cracks in the top, and tasted good as well. And she would cut out her 6-inch square and put it on a paper plate with her name and her phone number and address on the bottom, and send it uptown with Daddy to enter for her. In the afternoon at 4 o'clock, he had to go back and he had to see who won. Well, there was more than one year when Daddy would come back with the list of people that had won, and Mother would have to call my grandmother or maybe one of my aunts or who knows, and tell them that they won a prize. And they better be on the stage that night to collect it. The funny thing was, these people sometimes, I'm just saying, I wouldn't, tell you stories about my mom or nothing, but sometimes these people didn't recall entering. The real clue to me finally occurred to me sometime when I was in high school or college, that all that was left of those puddings in the kitchen and the dining room was just the rims. There were all these 6-inch squares missing. But anyway, it worked out. I can't tell you how many dozen times that recipe won prizes in the persimmon pudding contest for about 50 years, because that's about how long Mother entered it. She was really serious about this. And her cooking was so unbelievably memorable that when she became a restaurateur and a caterer later on, people would remember her cooking for the longest time. Someone came up to my children's father at a family Thanksgiving gathering one year, not too long ago, and said, "How did you get your hands on Edith Terrell's pie?" I thought she'd been gone for a while, and Mike said, yeah, about 15 years. And he said, well, how'd you get her pie? This is her pie. And he said, no, that's her recipe, but my daughter baked the pie. But to think that somebody would remember 15 years later what my mama's pumpkin pie tasted like. So she was a really, really good cook. And I will never make fried chicken or apple dumplings or many other recipes nearly as good as she did. And I treasure these memories, and I treasure that recipe because it was handed down by my grandmother, who was a Pickens. And that recipe today is about 150 years old. And you all have this in your information that was on your seats tonight. So if you're not sitting on it, you might want to take it home and try it out. And I do recommend frozen persimmons versus canned. But if you can't find the fresh ones, of course. But anyway, that's the story of Mama and the persimmon pudding. And that recipe is still ongoing in my family today. And as far as the New York Times goes, my son was disappointed they made a horrible mistake of Fuyu persimmons. My daughter was sorry she wasted ingredients trying it out. And they never called me back. That would never happen with the IndyStar or USA Today. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy your evening.